Thank you all very much. The security presence in the room has just diminished, which I think is a proper analogy for the world that we're experiencing right now. We're talking about risky business, peace and its enemies in the 21st century, and have a fantastic panel with me to explore that. Directly to my left, Oscar Fernandez-Taranco, the UN Assistant Secretary General for Peacekeeping Support. My good friend David Miliband, CEO of the International Rescue Committee, used to be Foreign Secretary for the United Kingdom. And finally, Michelle Nunn, the President of CARE USA. So get right into it. I mean, we have a new war just in the last few days that has also kicked off, making sure that we are as relevant as possible for this discussion. I'm wondering, in an environment that clearly is more unstable, more volatile, has more insecurity, to what extent is the reason for that the United States is less reliable, less counted on, not just in the last few years, but for a longer period of time? How much of this is about American withdrawal? How much of it is about something else? I'll start with you, Oscar.
Well, first of all, thank you, and it's a big pleasure to be here with you all. The question is precisely extremely topical, and I think what we are seeing today is the product of problems in the making over many years. And I think one particular issue that we're grappling with right now in the UN is the ability of the Security Council to actually take action and to be able to unite the key members of the Security Council for concerted action. I mean, the centrality of the problems that we are confronted with around the world, including those in the Middle East, particularly this particular conflict in Syria that has been the object of a lot of Security Council meetings, statements, resolutions, also attests to the fact that multilateralism right now and the threat to multilateralism, the threat to the values, the norms, the principles of concerted global action to address these various type of specific problems is breaking down. And so you have, in that particular part of the world, the emergence of new sub-regional powers that are filling in this void that this type of situation is resulting in.
David?
So he has to be diplomatic. Yes, it is your fault, but it's not only your fault. So America is both the cause of destabilization around the world, both through its actions and in some places its lack of action. But America's diminished place in the global order is both a symptom of other things going on. What else is going on? Obviously, there's a shift in the balance of relative economic power around the world. Secondly, there's a shift to asymmetry in the exercise of power. And thirdly, there's a diffusion of power from organizations to individuals and to movements, which are often being exploited by non-state actors in the kind of places where the International Rescue Committee works. In northeast Nigeria, there are 800,000 people living without any official governance because they're under the control of armed opposition groups. So American withdrawal from the global system, which you're right to say is not a process that began on January the 20th, 2017. In 2000, when President Clinton gave his valedictory State of the Union address, he said that now it was time for America to focus on the home front. And throughout America's history, it's had this sort of yin and yang between global engagement and retrenchment. But the retrenchment that's taking place, combined certainly with the isolationism and the transactionalism of the current administration, is contributing to world disorder, but it's not the only factor.
So yes to everything that David and Oscar said, and I do think that there is a difference in kind in the leadership of the administration currently in terms of the withdrawal. If you think about the Clinton administration, I think it was a focusing at home in order to be strong in the larger world. We are now seeing a just focus back and not a premise of American leadership in the world as a positive good. And CARE is celebrating our 75th anniversary. I think think that in our history, that is something quite different. We started with care packages, the invention of care packages. Harry Truman was one of the first to send care packages. And ever since then, we've had presidential leadership that has demonstrated both symbolically and I think from an investment perspective that America needs to focus on diplomacy, on development, in addition to defense in the world. And I think we see a material difference now, and I do think that we see the symptoms and the results of that throughout the world.
So, Secretary Clinton started off by talking about this most recent confrontation between the Turks and the Kurds, and now the Russians and the Americans, all in it in Syria. When Trump announced that, one of the things he said was, ISIS is 7,000 miles away. The Europeans, why aren't they doing this? They should take care of it. The Russians, others that care, they should take care of it, not the Americans. Americans clearly, that resonates with a lot of Americans today. Why is he wrong? Because it seems that all of you are saying that that approach is fundamentally wrong. What do you say to Americans?
Factually, there are two aspects that are wrong, aren't there? One is that there are 80 countries in the coalition in northeast Syria. And really, if you think about the...
I thought you were going to say it wasn't actually 7,000 miles away. I thought you were really...
Secondly, the remarkable thing about what was happening in northeast Syria, we've got 550 local staff members working in northeast Syria today, and we've got about 400 local staff members in northwest Syria. In northeast Syria, for 1,000 American troops, plus the other members of the coalition, you had relative stability and relative security for 5 million people. So the return on investment was very significant indeed. In the northwest of the country, there's no American presence. It's the Wild West. You've had 53 hospitals bombed since May this year by the Russians and the Syrians in the northwest of the country. So number one, it's not just the Americans. The return on investment was high. Secondly, America benefits from its global investment. This allegation that it's only the Chinese who've benefited from this 75 years of globalization isn't borne out by the facts. Sure, the relative balance of power has changed, but America has gained net, not just economically, but in security terms and political terms as well. And the great fear I have now is that we're going to move into a vacuum, because America is such a big player that if the democratic countries of the world don't have a leader on the international stage, then you don't just get vacuum at local level, you get what I call an age of impunity at international level, where the norms and laws that were built up so carefully over hundreds of years and took form in the 20 or 30 years after 1945, those norms and laws get broken, and then it becomes not just devil take the hindmost, but beggar my neighbor. I'm going to not do something because I fear that I'm going to have to pay more, and you end up in a vicious circle. That's the danger that we're in at the moment.
Now, Oscar, David calls it an age of impunity. That appears at odds with most United Nations statements. Is he right? And if he is, how do you respond to it as the UN?
No, I think David is absolutely right, and I think he has been one person who has really been able to coin this, particularly as it relates to respect of international humanitarian law, the principles of war, the basic and the essence of respects of human rights. So one of the reasons we see these types of behaviors repeatedly in theaters of war, but also across the globe, is the fact that many democracies right now are struggling, those that are democratic, but many, and particularly authoritarian, nationalistic, populist type of governments, have this notion that they can get away by doing these type of things, because the whole aspect of accountability, the whole issue of persecuting, if you will, those that have violated international norms and standards, the very core for the reason by which the UN was established, needs to be played out in those mechanisms. If we're not respecting the workings of the International Criminal Courts, if we're not respecting the standards of response, of humanitarian response, and you were relating to your efforts, the United Nations is actually present together with many non-governmental organizations working to protect, save lives, and actually this whole negotiation of humanitarian access is precisely where the UN becomes quite fundamental, that this is a joint partnership between different organizations in this area where impunity is becoming the norm, and linked to that is the shrinking space of, if you will, democratic human rights and space for civil society organizations. So this, I think, there's many reasons for how we got here, and some of them have to do with a lot of the impacts of unbalanced globalization. There's sort of the many that have been left behind by these big technological, these big transformative changes that have happened in world economic dynamics, that have left quite a long stretch of rust belts around the world, of people that have been left behind and who are claiming this particular attention, the focus back into what has not happened in individual countries. And sometimes this can translate into quite a dramatic shift in foreign policy decisions and priorities.
How does this affect your mission?
Well, when you think about the violation of international humanitarian law, in the last few years, just 3 years, 660 aid workers have been killed. So we experience, literally every month, a series of violations to aid workers at CARE. I know you do at IRC. And where is the moral voice? And I do believe this is a place where the moral voice for human rights, for international law is missing in the US, but also globally and in the world. And it makes an enormous difference. I would also say that I do think we have to remind the US citizenry and also the world that the world is joining together to take responsibility on many of these issues. If you look at who is resettling refugees, it's largely lower and middle income countries. I was in Uganda a few weeks ago, 1.3 million refugees over the last few years that have been opened to Uganda and that they are resettling. And so I think Americans need to be reminded that others are standing with us, that America does have an important and vital role, and that it is in our interests, and we've seen that historically, and we see that throughout time. And actually, if you look at the survey information, most Americans actually still want America to play a role in the world, and they do believe in the idea of multilateral institutions.
Does America have to stand, I'm going to follow up with you on this, Michelle, does America have to stand for something different to make that effective? In part because of the challenges that come from other actors in the world that don't share American traditional values and norms of governance, politically and economically, but also because a lot of Americans increasingly don't necessarily believe in those themselves. Does that change the way the U.S. has to present itself as a leader to the extent that it does so?
I suspect I'm old-fashioned in the Churchillian sense of I still believe that our democracy is the best system and that we should stand with those values, and that we can do that with a degree of humility and a collaborative spirit that shows that we can work across systems for shared goals. And so when I think about China, I think about the opportunities to work around global public health, around the Belt and Road, around development. I think there are shared interests even when there are different values.
David, do you believe in the Churchillian sense that democracy stands still as the beacon, as the way that leadership can actually articulate itself globally?
Yes, I do, because it's sort of in my DNA, really. If you've lived a free life, the idea that that an unfree life is better is anathema, really. But I really think we should take seriously the fact that Freedom House report that 113 countries have suffered democratic recession since 2006. 2006 was not just the year in which the responsibility to protect started to be dishonored. It was passed in 2005. It said the international community had responsibilities to citizens when states were failing on them. We've seen a gradual decline in respect for that principle. But we've also seen, or relatedly we've seen, a decline in political freedom. It's been a bad decade, not just for democracy, but for, I think one has to be specific, liberal democracy, because liberal democracy says that majority rule is right, but minorities have to be protected, and that's what's on the stake at the moment. Now, I do hold deep in my soul that repression ultimately eats itself, that repression leads to revolt, revolt leads to instability, instability leads to change. But it's much harder to make that case from the facts that exist today than 5 or 10 years ago. 10 years ago, people would have said to you, just to take one example, people would have said, look, the idea that a country can block internet access is ridiculous. Now we know that actually, if you're determined enough and willing to spend enough on it, you can, as a state, control the means of information flow in a far more thoroughgoing way than we might have guessed.
Kashmir's been out for months now, and it's actually been quite effective in ensuring that they're keeping the people down.
So to my point, and so the mustering of liberal democracy as something for the heart and the head is a massive challenge, I think, for the next 30 years. And I say that not just as a matter of morals, but also to this point that in the end, every government governs in coalition with its own people. Whether you're a democracy or whether you're an autocracy, in the end, you're in coalition with your own people. And in a democratic system, there are formal ways for you to be kicked out if you lose that coalition. In an undemocratic system, there aren't those formal ways, but in the end, it'll come and bite you. And that's why I think it's a matter of interest as well as morals that democracy, liberal democracy, holds out the best hope of tackling humankind's problems. But that's not to say, not to blind ourselves to the fact that, as we saw from the heard in the previous conversation, crowds don't always have wisdom.
Now, Oscar, in a sense, this question is the hardest for you because you're representing the UN and all of its 193 member states. Chinese are giving a lot more than they used to, particularly in peacekeeping, right? A lot more than the Western states are. Does this make you answer the question differently in terms of how you think about democracy and its values as we discuss leadership?
Now, first, to the point of contributions, I think the UN welcomes increased contributions to its budget precisely to be able to do its job of peacekeeping, of negotiating and mediating.
So you'd rather if the U.S. did not do month to month as they are
No, the
right
point
now.
being that every yes, that would be very helpful given the cyclical budgetary crisis that we seem to be incurring. But I think this is part of the revitalization of multilateralism, the revitalization of the UN. This UN has to work for every member state. And the only way it works is that each member state is equally invested. And, we have formulas that are called, the assessed contributions that have a lot to do with the ability and possibility of member states to actually make those significant contributions. But as we speak, with the many peacekeeping operations on the ground that are running with very low budgets, or humanitarian response appeals that are underfunded to the order of 30% as a norm, in the multiple billions of dollars, So this I think requires a rethinking about how this engagement, the centrality of the UN, its norms, its principles, its ability, actually it is the forum where we hold member states accountable to declarations, to instruments that they have signed up for. So this is not a free pass. You don't sign norms, declaration, principles of humanitarian, international humanitarian, and then violate them. So this is, I think, one is the issue of accountability. The second is certainly coming from the peace-building dimension. Clearly, democratic societies, democratic structures are enhancers of peace. We don't see democratic countries entering at war or even descending into civil wars unless clearly the internal social contract is fundamentally frayed. And this is, I guess, the tension that we're all witnessing now is this expansion of democracy, the expansion of markets that we saw after the fall of the Berlin Wall has also been accompanied with this decreasing in the quality of democracy and this increasing rift. And at the basics is this distrust or increasing mistrust between people and their governments, people and their political representatives, between countries. So this notion that we need to address the trust deficits that we have across continents and between citizens and states is increasingly becoming a particularly important reason, and which explains, this rise of populism, the rise of nationalism, the rise of xenophobia is explainable through the broken social contract that needs constantly to be focused upon. And this is somewhere where the UN, it's at least an area where the UN is working very hard at work, trying to translate these sustainable development goals into practical results for people.
And you'll note, Oscar talked first about the fact that authoritarian states don't do well in terms of social contract, but then at the end, the fact that, the social contract isn't working right now very well with democratic states, and that creates a challenge. Now, just this morning, the IMF came out with their global economic outlook, which is by far the most anemic and dour since before the financial crisis. Given both the funding challenges of the UN right now, but also the broader structural issues that you've been just talking about, how do you think that plays out in 2020? Where are the stresses that get much worse, much more challenging in an environment? Because all of these challenges we've had the last few years have been in a period of relatively robust economic growth. Suddenly that's not true. How does that change the way you think?
Well, I think you need to go back to when and how robust economic growth happened. And many times the robust economic growth and the ability to extricate millions of people out of poverty had a lot to do with open trade mechanisms and protection mechanisms and direct investments, if you will, to address those structural deficiencies in countries. The minute you have states that are retrenching and focusing inwards, the whole global construct of and the way we are all interrelated in this day and age makes it very difficult for any one member state to somehow withdraw and think that they can actually address their issues unilaterally. And so what this puts to bear is actually how interconnected we are. It puts to bear how important many of these global problems requiring global solutions, if you will. And again, the notion that we need to reinvent, we need to reform many of the existing multilateral organizations to speak much more directly to the real need and time that is affecting people. Putting people at the center of this equation is something that is more said than actually done. And I think this is where, at least in the UN, we're trying to refocus equitable growth, addressing poverty, eradicating poverty, addressing exclusion, marginalization, inequalities. These are the big topics that many governments are struggling with and can be addressed in both national and international relations.
So David, in an environment where this is going to get more challenging and a lot of countries are going to be focusing on themselves, I mean, Oscar's from Argentina originally, of course. My God, they're certainly going through that right now. Maybe I'll give you a hard time about that later. David, where are we going to find the leadership from? Don't say the UK.
So I think two parts of the answer to that. When governments are in retreat, and governments are in retreat, so the premise of your question is right. When governments are in retreat, business, NGOs, civil society has to step forward. Mm-hmm. And so I think we have to recognize that the politics of localism is dragging governments to think more and more inward, paradoxically at a time when the greatest gains come from thinking globally or at least regionally. And in that time of government retreat, my very strong feeling is that there's a responsibility on those of us outside government to be mobilizers of change. We have to be the incubators of new solutions that I talked about. We have to be the demonstrators of practice of how to do things. We have to be the creators of coalitions that force an agenda. We have to be the actors when governments don't do things. So to take Syria as an example, it should be government bodies that are documenting human rights and other international humanitarian law abuses. In fact, it's organizations like the Syrian Observatory on Human Rights, the German organization that's taking certain military officials to court. So there's a civil society, private business, citizen mobilization piece of this that is very important. Second thing is that I was very pleased and struck by the decision of the Nobel Prize Committee to give the Nobel Peace Prize this year to Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. And I think it was important not just because of the 180-degree turn that he managed to engineer in that country, but also because of the signal that it sent, that if we confine our search for quote-unquote leadership to traditional actors in the US or in Europe, we're going to narrow the field far too much. And so I think the second part of my answer would be that we're going to have to look for new players in the field. So when you're thinking about climate or when you're thinking about trade, you're going to have to think about different leaders emerging, because I think that the traditional transatlantic focus is not going to deliver. I actually am pretty positive about the future of the European Union. I'm less positive about the UK's position in it, but that's traumatic story.
You
that
said we weren't going to talk
I haven't
about
said
Brexit.
I haven't said the word. I didn't say the word. I deliberately didn't say the word. I promised you I wouldn't say the B word. But I think Europe is going to be in a process over the next 5 to 10 years that regirds its strength and preserves its unity, and that's going to limit its external projection. I think we're going to have to look elsewhere, and I think that's in some ways refreshing.
Yeah, I mean, he can't help himself, you see, but that's okay. So, Michelle, does all of this, does it make you feel more empowered in terms of your policy space, in terms of the role for you as an organization, the need for you, in terms of the support that you get from the private sector, understanding that governments are in retreat right now? How do you think about that?
Well, I think that I do think it creates an imperative for action, and I think that those of us who are in the civic sector or the private sector do feel that incumbency for new ways of leading. And so, in that sense, yes, I do think it is not as if there are a huge number of additional resources that are being made available to us for that. So, thinking through how do we use innovation and technology and new forms of partnership to do things exponentially greater with a constrained resource base, I think is particularly challenging and hard. I do think we need to look for non-traditional actors and leaders. I do think we have a global citizenry that has never been more empowered, but in this sort of battle of the utilization of technology, I would not say that the sort of global citizenry for good is necessarily overpowering some of the darker side and forces of that technology. So I think that those of us in civil society are called to a kind of audacity and creativity that is difficult and challenging, but imperative at this particular moment. I also think we cannot give up on the reform and evolution of some of these institutions, because as important as it is, for instance, for Michael Bloomberg and the mayors to step into the U.S. vacuum of leadership around the Paris Climate Accord, still, American leadership from a governmental perspective needs to step into that as we go forward. So we have to look at how do we take some of these calcified institutions, take a hard look at them ourselves, democratic institutions, multilateral institutions, and think how are we going to revivify them as we go forward.
Okay, so Michelle, when I hear we have to reform our institutions, I frequently have to stop myself from my eyes glazing over, right? For example, we all kind of know that campaign finance reform would be important in the United States to reform our institution, but nobody actually thinks it's remotely feasible. We kind of know that the Security Council can't get anything done because of the veto system, so we focus on the places where we can do stuff. When you say we need to refocus on institutional reform, and you ran for Senate in the United States.
Unsuccessfully.
But you were close, and you tried. Is there anything, I mean, just between us here in the audience,
Yeah.
I mean, do you really buy it? Do you think that is that the place we should really be making efforts in the United States right now?
No, I'm a hopeless optimist around this, and I think first of all, you cannot.
So no, you don't.
You cannot forsake these institutions, and we cannot lead ourselves into a degree of cynical complacency that keeps us on the sidelines and that has us believe that it is impossible to achieve campaign finance reform. It has proven to be extraordinarily difficult, but I think that we have to find even incremental ways to demonstrate to ourselves that we can change our institutions. Otherwise, we are left with the choice of literally watching the deterioration of our institutional democracy. And that is not a choice that we can make in the affirmative. We have to commit ourselves and recommit ourselves over and over again and not give up.
So, because the response, the other side of that is if we stipulate governments will be in retreat, then how do we work with other organizations? I'm going to hit myself for asking this, but I will, since you talked about reform in the UN. Tell the audience one concrete thing in the near term that you think is doable that would actually move the needle in terms of making the UN more effective on the global stage.
Well, first of all, I think, it is the defining, I think, moment for this particular Secretary General that has come in to the UN with a very strong agenda of literally changing the way the UN does, regular business. So he's the first SG to actually, Secretary General, to actually launch 3 interrelated reforms. Reforming the way the development structure, again, and this is addressing our own internal fragmentation. I think one of the biggest challenges all organizations have is how you unite the different branches of work, if you will, for common purpose. And in the UN, we've had notorious, pillars or notorious fragmentation between the way we do humanitarian work, the way we do development work, the way we undertake human rights, and peace and security work. This is an SG who has seen the value and the need to actually integrate these lines of work, if you will, to address this very obvious and basic issue, which is political solutions. Around political solutions to some of these intractable problems, how do the different parts of the UN system come together to resolve, to prevent conflict, putting prevention at the very heart of what the UN does, sort of shifting gears from what has been now traditionally a response mechanism, peacekeeping operations, humanitarian response, emergency crisis, this and the other, to putting prevention as the, if you will, issue that is assessing the performance of this organization. So it's not an easy thing, because this is not the stuff that makes headline news in CNN or anywhere. Prevention is successful when we don't actually talk about it. And going back to some of these issues, concretely what it means in the case of Ethiopia or in the case of Sudan, 2 countries that are going through dramatic democratic opening, reforms, political reforms, economic reforms, reforms in terms of their relationships with their neighbors and as promoters of peace agreements, not just internal, but with the many countries that surround them, that will have a huge impact on the situation of IDPs, internally displaced people, the refugees, etc., is how the UN is able to support this process, this government, to actually deliver. And we've talked about the very important role of non-governmental organizations. I think it is crucial, that in that environment, how we build institutions, how we build the judiciaries, how we build the security sector and its performance and respect of human rights, etc. This is part of the work that needs doing, right? It's not maybe the most attractive work, but it is what needs to be done if we are trying to address this issue of social contract that we were just talking about.
I knew I didn't want to ask that question. Okay. So on Nobel Peace Prize, as someone who is responsible for peacekeeping, how happy when you saw that the Ethiopian Prime Minister got the nod? How appropriate, how happy were you that was justice served in your view?
No, I think as we were just saying, I think this is a hugely important recognition, but also it's a very important symbol of what is it that we recognize as being truly transformative. And I think in the case of Ethiopia, this is a country that has done tremendous work to address issues of famine, of poverty, and whatnot. But it is about rethinking the politics, the internal politics of that country. So when I'm referring to political solutions many times, it has to do with how do you address the needs not just of majority populations, but minority populations, and this redistribution and this notion of inclusive governance. Inclusive governance is at the very heart of peace building, at the very heart of reconciliation and fighting exclusion. So I think, again, it's the example of a leader who has been bold, has taken the country to the next level, has forged peace with its neighbors, has contributed to peace in Sudan and other places. And this is the type of rewards that I think, it's truly matters.
Oscar is right about that. But think about this. The long list of peace agreements over the last year is not very long. Now we have to think about that. One part of that is about leadership, but there's another thing that I think is really important. And Vartan, this speaks directly to the mission of Carnegie in the 21st century in a way that's different than the 20th century. In the 20th century, the issue of peacemaking was about peace between states. Mm-hmm. The issue in the 21st century is about peace within states. In the 20th century, the conflicts were between states. In the 21st century, the conflicts are within states. Now that poses spectacularly difficult problems for the United Nations Security Council, because the bargain in 1945 was to say that whether you're communist or capitalist, whether you're a democracy or whether you're a dictatorship, there's a set of norms that will be established, and it fudged the issue of where sovereignty lay. It's an intergovernmental body, but it adheres to international agreements that commit to individuals. The issue that we have today is that when you've got a conflict within a country, the tools of peacemaking developed for wars between states are not very well suited to the resolution of wars within states. And that's why you have the situation. I mean, if you take somewhere, well, the minute you get specific, it becomes difficult. But whether you think about Yemen, or whether you think about Syria, or whether you think about Somalia, or whether you think about what's happening in Cameroon at the moment, in the west of Cameroon, they all raise, for all that there are proxy powers, they all raise an absolutely fundamental issue about internal organization. And there, Oscar's in an impossible position, because there is part doctrine of the Security Council that internal affairs must remain that and have nothing to do with outside powers. And there's an alternative argument, which is that the trump card, sorry, no pun intended, the trump card is protection of human rights, protection of the rights of the individual. And I think this is the question for the 21st century Carnegie, thinking about peacemaking and peace building and peacekeeping.
And is this why
in the 21st
the
century.
Russians are doing comparatively well in these environments? Because their foreign policy orientation is more sharply oriented towards local asymmetries of power, sub-state actors, being able to take advantage of vacuums when they exist.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. They're also willing to do things that I hope the military guidance that exists for American or European troops don't allow. They are willing to bomb hospitals, even when they're given the coordinates of where those hospitals are. And I think I'm right in saying that the military discipline in the US absolutely prohibits that. But it's not only that reason. They've also chosen to use forms of power, notably air power, that, relatively speaking, insulate their own population from the consequences of what's happening. Whether it's we can have an argument about whether what they've done in Syria will build sustainable peace or not, because what we see in northwest of Syria is 3.5 million people living there. And there's no way that you're going to be able to resolve the situation in the northwest of Syria from the air. And the government of Syria doesn't want to go in on the ground. The Russians can't win from the air, so you're a bit stuck. But I think this issue of what are the appropriate tools for peacemaking within states, how do they respect the rights of a government, legitimate or otherwise, how do they respect the rights of minority groups within that, is an absolutely fundamental issue. We're very engaged, for example, I know you are too, in Myanmar and now in Bangladesh. So 900,000 people chased out of Myanmar on pain of death, now living in Bangladesh. Bangladesh did open the doors to them, but doesn't want to grant them citizenship. That's going to become a frozen, if not conflict, a frozen tragedy for the 21st century. And I think that's where I confess that I don't have the answers at all, but the tools for intrastate diplomacy are different than the tools for interstate diplomacy.
Michelle, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just want to reinforce this because, I mean, David knows, and in our work, we see the consequences of these conflicts, and they are 80% of the humanitarian response is coming from conflict. It's coming from these places of Afghanistan and Syria and South Sudan. And it is only likely to get worse because if you look at, for instance, concentrations of extreme poverty, 80% of extremely poor people will live in fragile states by 2030. So think about the compounding impact of that as we go forward. So it does beg the question of some sort of perhaps optimistic or idealistic hope that we can and will not only reform institutions, because if you think about CARE, the UN, the institutions of Bretton Woods, these are we're celebrating 75-year anniversaries. And so it's incumbent upon us not only to, I think, defend the these institutions, but to also evolve these institutions and to think about also what are the creative and audacious ways that we need to create new forms of governance or institutions that will enable us to deal with 21st century problems, because otherwise we're dealing with institutions that were created and for 20th century situations that we're trying to address in contexts that may no longer be as relevant.
So I want to talk about some concrete implications on the ground. Over the last few years, we see the Chinese consolidating power, also spending a lot more money, getting a lot more international in their orientation. We've seen the US willing to do a lot less. Talk about how have you experienced the implications of that concretely on the ground? Give us an example.
Yeah, so I mentioned that I was in Uganda earlier in the fall, and I was traveling there with Senator Chris Coons and Chris Van Hollen on what we call a learning tour trip with CARE.
A couple of the best as well.
A couple of the very best.
Really know the region, yeah.
And so when we landed, Chris, who's been there many times, Chris
More than
Coons,
any senator.
Yes, said, we went from one place to another. He said, the road that we're on is unfathomable to me. It was built by the Chinese. 2 years before, it would have taken us 2.5 hours what it took us 25 minutes to cover. So there's an example of the Chinese presence, which is pervasive throughout Africa. All of us know this when we are just doing our traveling. And I will say at the same time, as we went out to the farthest stretches of places throughout Uganda and were engaged in the humanitarian work of refugee resettlement, or even the sort of entrepreneurship of young people, the Chinese presence was not there. That was where we saw the Americans and the Europeans. And so I do think we have to think about how do we going forward, really determine how America has a presence that is values-based and that is distinctive to our assets and that is complementary to China's, and hopefully we can also have an influence on their work as well.
So that's a fantastic set of examples, and I want to push you a little harder. So if you were to take a little snapshot of the meetings that you had on the ground in Uganda this trip, as well as, let's say, from 3 years ago or 6 years ago, how would you say the balance of orientation of the local people is changing, if at all? Is the United States still as aspired towards? Are the Chinese more relevant? Does the soft power feel like it's eroding? What did you think? What's your takeaway?
Well, as we met with government officials and had those kinds of conversations, I will say that the leadership of Uganda was very blunt in stating the pragmatic partnership that was going to continue to be essential with China. They would neither disavow it nor would they do anything but say this will be essential to our future.
It's very NBA-like in that regard.
Well, and practical and also, interested in their own development, which is what they should be. And they also recognize the invaluable role that America plays. But they did literally say, we need you to show up. We need you to be present. And so I do think that that kind of conversation is different today than it would have been 10 years ago. And I think that the kinds of conversations that people within the everyday citizenry are having is also shaped and will continue to be different based upon the influence that they see on the ground.
So I mean, the funny thing, of course, is that Chris, his response to that is, let's try to do something to respond to Belt and Road. The BUILD Act, as he will readily admit, it's not really a response to Belt and Road. So the challenge of what the Americans can do, despite all of these great efforts on the ground, but at the government level, is an open question. Anything that you see that you think starts?
Well, I do think that I would say that that incremental progress of the BUILD Act is important and can be a distinguishing and differentiated way for us to engage in the world. So I wouldn't give up on that. And I do think, again, we have to live in, and like David, I'm not sure exactly what all the answers are, but to our own values and our differentiated capacity for making a difference. I mean, just to further the example, we went to a burrito lunch place, just like this is the place to get burritos and coffee when you're in Kampala. And it was actually a social enterprise started by a group of faith-based organizations from the US who had come together and said, if we want to be more powerful, we have to create a burrito place so that we can meet together. right? So that we have an assembly point, at least, for coalition building, for coming together, for coordinating. But the bottom line is that those faith-based groups are unique in terms of the kind of organic NGO, philanthropic, private sector engagement that the U.S. brings. So how do we unleash that in more powerful and concerted ways as we go forward?
So David,
Can I just make a really, I hope this isn't too prosaic a point, but you and I were at a meeting over the summer, and one thing came through absolutely clear in discussing the American-China relationship. If you as Americans only think about America versus China and don't think about America plus all of its allies alongside, engaging, coexisting with China, it's not going to work. And so I think that the imperative is how this country thinks about its alliances. That's historically been its great strength. And if you think about the numerical, the population size as one indicator, 1.4 billion Chinese, 350 million Americans, there are 580 million Europeans waiting to hear whether or not you're willing to work with them.
is Turkey in that number, by the way?
Well, Turkey, as we failed unsuccessfully to explain in the misbegotten campaign of 2016, Turkey is not a member of the European Union, much to my, in various ways, it's not even on the road to being a member, to my regret. But you'll even up the conversation if the Chinese can see that there is a global community that they are plugging into. If it's, and I don't just mean transatlantic, there's American alliances around the world. If the non-Chinese parts of the world are splintered, then it changes the calculus for China. And frankly, it changes the calculus for Europeans as well. I mean, I live and work in New York, but I'm a European. If we look out, we've seen that China has been an all-weather friend for the European Union for the last 10 years, 15 years. It's been a steady friend of Europe as an institution. And the thought process in European heads is how to hedge against American unpredictability.
Now, question.
That's the severity of the situation. And by the way, the Chinese know it.
Now, David, you said the Chinese have been an all-weather friend of the European Union. So when the Chinese set up their 15+1 dialogues to go in and have separate conversations with the East Europeans, get them plugged into Belt and Road and give them money and ensure that they can do things with China that the Europeans as a whole would really not like, is that considered part of that all-weather friendship?
No, I mean, you were raising your eyebrows at me and telling me to sort of shorten my answer, so I didn't want to go, but I would have, the next thing I was going to say is the 16+1, which is the sort of split that the Chinese have tried to engineer, especially with Eastern Europe, is seen as very negative behavior. I think it's even splitting now, the 16+1. The Chinese have been pushed back quite strongly on that. But obviously there's a fear that certain parts of Europe are more biddable than others.
Very much so, yeah.
And in all of its engagements with Russia, with China, with anybody else, with the US actually, European unity is the basis on which we can become serious players. And if you think about the way the European Union plays in the trade area, actually, I don't know enough about it, but the way Europe has played in this GDPR area in privacy, it's showing itself to be a regulatory power of real standard-setting capacity. And if we'd had a competition here 2 years ago and said, will it be the Chinese, the Americans, or the Europeans that come up with the first global privacy regulation, you'd have looked at Europe and said, 28 different countries, there's no way they're going to agree. But actually, the imperatives of being a global standard setter made Europe an effective player, but only because it was united.
And in part because they don't have any of the companies. So
no, I mean, Europe would love to have some national champions in that, or international champions in that area. I don't think that's right. I think there's a different politics around privacy, even within Europe, but there's a different European culture compared to the
let me actually, since you're on technology, and we haven't addressed it all yet, David, and I know you think about this, to what extent do you think that the latest trends in technology are actually making it much harder, much more challenging to address some of these global security issues?
Well, the precise way you framed the question, to what extent does technology make it harder to address the global security issues? I think the way I'd answer that is to say technology, in the way it's connected individuals, it's created a dark side of the web that is outside many governments' purview and reach. That's created a new force of destabilization. The trouble is, a lot of the most destabilizing forces in the world don't need the dark web to be able to do their bad business. Net, the technological revolution that we're living through has been a destabilizing force, if that's what it's net added to insecurity. And governments are playing catch up, but they're getting better at playing catch up. First of all, in defending themselves. And I wasn't directly involved in internal security when I was in government, but in the external aspects of it I was. We're getting better at that defensive dimension. When it comes to how you deploy internationally to try and help countries and communities build themselves up against internal and external actors who are destabilizing, it's a very much more difficult thing, I would say.
And I'm glad you went there because, I mean, in the context of saying the Americans need to engage in multilateralism or they're going to be on the short end of the stick, I take it your argument would be the Europeans on technology in particular. This is where the Americans would find an awful lot of utility to work with the Europeans who've been out in front on this.
Yeah, I would, but I don't think it's just, I think that across the Middle East, across the swathes of Africa that Michelle rightly referred to, the danger is of a vacuum. And the most striking thing for me, if I go to South Sudan, I think I'm right in saying at the moment, when I last went to South Sudan, there is no American ambassador. This is basic. And everything from the peak of diplomacy to the economic engagement to the aid engagement, which frankly is still is penny pinching. Europe now spends more on humanitarian aid around the world than the United States. 28 countries together, but nonetheless, it's never happened before. The symptom, if you're not going forward, you're going backwards in the modern world, and that's, I think, the real challenge.
So, Oscar, I want to play to your optimism. 2020. Of all of the conflicts that you are looking at, engaged in, recognizing that last year there was a short list, where do you think we're close to a breakthrough?
Close to a breakthrough. This is a part of the.
Who's going to get it in 2020? Yeah, who's going to get the Nobel Peace Prize? Who's on your list?
Well, I think what's interesting, and I think we were somehow addressing, is the extremely important role of civil society, and particularly, I would say, women's organizations and young people. I think this is something that certainly in our line of work in the UN, this is part of what's changing. It's the way we are increasing partnering, if you will, with those that have leadership and have ability to create that movement.
Yeah, but peace. There's a chance. Let's be honest. There's a better than even chance that Yemen will be less violent in a year's time than it is now.
Well, if we start focusing country by country, one could say that, that Sudan, nobody would have said today Sudan, we would see what we're seeing in Sudan, right? A year ago, we still had Bashir very much in charge. And so I think part of the issue is how quickly are we in supporting movements of change? And this is a question that we either do or we don't do. And I think there are movements of change. There's citizen coalitions, there's the private sector, there's academia, there's think tanks, there's a lot that goes, it used to be a time when the UN was at the center of everything, and that's no longer the case. The issue now is how organizations partner with each other around issues of values, around issues of norms, that we create coalitions and a sort of a differentiated but common approach, if you will, so that the end result works for people. And so, again, I keep coming back to the Sustainable Development Goals because this is a very powerful agenda. It's, sort of lost many times in the bureaucratic speak that we use, but it is about Ethiopia in the midst of an extremely important humanitarian response for more than 3.2 million people displaced, that we're not just providing humanitarian aid, but we're trying to resolve what led to that displacement to begin with. And this is about intercommunal relationships. It's about the non-state actors that become very powerful. In this new age of conflict, it's non-state actors that are very much center of this equation. So we were just saying traditional means don't work in this particular environment, but what does work is precisely the type of grassroots mobilization, and I want to stress this very important role of women's empowerment and young people, which are the majority of the population of the planet right now, who are absolutely and totally underrepresented in all of these debates, in all of the decisions, and all the focus of where investments are going.
No, and Michelle, you want to get in, but there's no question that over the course of the last 10 years, we've seen the United Nations do a lot more in partnering with non-traditional organizations, precisely in response to this government pullback. And I mean, I think one of the reasons, I assume, David, that you thought Yemen was interesting is precisely because a lot of the governments that have been involved in Yemen recognize that they've been gotten so bloodied that the United Nations actually has more space to operate. Michelle.
Yeah, just another note on the hope side is I do think that the women and girls and the gender equality, if you think about the momentum that we need to create there, but if you think about the possibilities there, that there's a huge opportunity over the next 20 years to engage women and girls in a very powerful way. And so, I mean, as an example, we know that if you correlate countries' peacefulness, there's a higher correlation between gender equality and peacefulness than GDP. We know that if you look at the sort of study over 20 years, that there's a 35% increase of the longevity of peace processes when women are involved. And yet, we only have 4% of the signatories to peace processes over the last 20 years were women. So if you think about, on the upside of what's possible over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, really creating gender equality would open up a latent set of possibilities that I think could be transformational.
Does that mean Africa, more urbanization, more peace process as a consequence of that?
Say again?
Oh, just as you're seeing much more urbanization in Africa, women therefore are much more part of decision-making processes, you would necessarily see a peace dividend as a consequence of that, or not really? Because you have so much poor governance, but on the other hand, the economic side, you're seeing women come into those societies.
Yeah, but I think it has to go hand in hand with inclusive governance. And so if there's not a social contract that is inclusive of participatory, of leadership from women at the institutional infrastructures, as well as some of the socioeconomics, I mean, I think those things have to go in hand.
Was Rwanda the big win there in the last couple of decades?
Rwanda is an example where we have seen enormous both economic change and gender equity. So and more opportunity, but I think it's a story that there's a lot to learn from, for sure.
So before we close, I want to go dark for a bit. David, you know, I mean, we do see in 3 years of Trump, we haven't actually had serious foreign policy crises yet, maybe until this past few days. But with the global economy having some challenges in the next 12 months, and given the trends of the democracy deficit that you articulated earlier, if we keep going like this, where's the place that the wheels are likely to fall off? What are the things that most concern you in the global environment over the next couple of years?
So short term, it's my job to think about the places where most people's lives are at risk. And so you're led to think about Yemen, 24 million people in humanitarian need. You're led to think about Syria, 8-9 million people in humanitarian need. You're led to think about northeast Nigeria, tens of millions of people in that part of the world. You're led to think about Afghanistan and what happens to a forestalled peace process that is struggling to gain traction with the Afghan authorities themselves, because they weren't really part of the dialogue that Secretary Clinton talked about earlier. And then you also have to worry about the big state events that can still cause mammoth difficulty. Look, the tension between India and Pakistan has got to be on anyone's risk register. You're right to say that the Yemen experience seems to have led both first of all, the Iranians with the United Arab Emirates, but also the Saudis seems directly with the Houthis. There's some talking going on, but you've got to worry about the crowded space in the Straits of Hormuz as being a place of enormous danger. I also worry about overreach. I mean, I worry about what Russia is thinking it wants to do next, because it will perceive itself to have had successes in Ukraine and in Syria. And I know people in the Baltics are very worried. So I think that there are then big state flashpoints that you have to worry about. What you've all got to know is that he produces the best risk register in January. So this is all just him going into his milching machine. So that on January the 1st, the Eurasia Group will tell you what the real top 10 risks are. But I think you have to look where resource stress, corruption, and misgovernance and poverty come together, and that leads you to some pretty dangerous parts of the world.
Oscar, how did you come out of the United Nations General Assembly meeting this year? All of these heads of state coming in, addressing all of these issues, your bilateral calendars, complete. I mean, how hopeful / despondent were you coming out of it, and why?
Yeah,
as we look towards the next year.
I mean, added to David's long list, I mean, we could add Central America, the Sahel, the Great Lakes region. I mean, there's a lot of problems that are also sub-regional in nature and that feed off each other. And this is part of the changing nature of conflict and the changing nature of displacements and refugee dynamics. But I think critical to all of us sitting in this room is the challenge of global climate change and how societies will come to grip in real time, because I mean the education process, the political leadership process, the financing process, everything that needs to align for the very survival of the planet and its people is something that needs to happen in historical terms extremely fast. So the sense of urgency that the Secretary General, sort of pushed leaders to come to grips, that they need to come to grips with a situation that can't just be fended off or ignored for much longer. And here, I think the crucial role of the private sector, of cities, of mayors, I mean, this is where we're seeing leadership these days. It's not necessarily heads of state, or the people that are closest in governance to the real people, who are already seeing the impact of a lot of this. So that, I think, is one particular challenge this next year and the years to come, because this is the time for action and decisions. And a lot of this seems to be held hostage by electoral processes. And I think this is the strange situation we find ourselves, is that somehow in certain countries, people expect that this issue will be dealt with if a certain election goes one way or the other. And certainly there are some countries that historically have played a leadership role, cannot sort of withdraw from this agenda, particularly not just because it's one of the principal emitters and polluters, but because there's a leadership here that involves all the people of the world. The second, I would say that I think also because it's germane in Latin America, where I come from, the cyber warfare space, particularly as it relates to elections, electoral processes, the combination of this extremely powerful instrument, the internet, social media, the cyberspace, etc., but being instrumentalized in manners that is literally, it's a form of warfare, very sophisticated, and some of the very state actors that are driving this, in an environment that is absolutely unregulated. I mean, this is what's amazing, and this is why the UN was founded, to create those norms, those principles, those rules, those protocols that actually create codes of conduct. We were talking about privacy, but all the issues that we're addressing around electoral. And I say this because elections universally tend to be the flashpoints for violence. It's where the emotions, where the identity, where who wins and how they win, and who lost and how they lost, is central to peace building. And the construct and the ability, to have this acceptance of results. So I say this, I think there's many other things we could be addressing. And the final, of course, is I think the notion of inclusivity, how we really address people's needs and relate to that sense of exclusion. This notion of empathy that is extremely important. I think the Carnegie Foundation speaks to this humanism that we need to bring back to public life, to the way we work, to the way we interact is central. And education, I think, and I know both of you are doing great work there. This is key. Education for peace, education to help mitigate and manage conflict is central to the way forward.
So Michelle, you get the last word. If we're able to turn this around, and the United States starts actually playing a greater and greater role in leading and responding to some of these challenges again, It's because we've done what?
Well, I think to get back to my earlier points, I think it is around reconciling, for instance, the political will of the American people around outcomes like climate change or campaign finance reform or gun safety, as an example, to the democratic institutions, which there is a great cleavage right now between the majority of the way that many Americans feel and I think what is actually happening from a leadership perspective. So somehow institutions need to be reformed, eyes glazing over, I see, but incremental citizenry and citizen action to actually stand up, and it will also be the creativity, the boldness of our civil society to step into reimagining some of the possibilities before us, and I think it will be because we are engaged with the rest of the world in a truly multilateral way, in which we have embraced the possibilities and the imperative of the challenges that are before us, like climate change, in a way that is truly future-oriented and that is about the long term and not just our short term.
Oscar, David, Michelle, will you please give me a hand?
Thank you.
Fantastic panel today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.